The morning started like any other Saturday in Pine Ridge: crisp autumn air, the smell of burning leaves, and the distant hum of ATVs echoing through the valley. I was loading my Yamaha Grizzly onto the trailer when I heard the familiar screech of Karen Whitmore's voice cutting through the peaceful morning air. "Excuse me! Excuse me!" she hollered from across the street, her perfectly manicured finger pointing at me like I'd just committed a felony. Karen was the kind of woman who made homeowners associations tremble, immaculately dressed even at 7 a.m., with that particular brand of righteous indignation that could curdle milk at 50 paces. I pretended not to hear her, focusing on securing the tie-down straps with perhaps more attention than necessary. Karen and I had history, and none of it was pleasant. She lived in the fancy subdivision that bordered the state forest where I liked to ride, and she'd made it her personal mission to ensure that anyone who dared to enjoy motorized recreation within a 5-mile radius of her property would face her wrath. "I know you can hear me, Tyler Morrison," she shrieked, her voice rising to a pitch that probably had dogs howling 3 counties over. "You cannot continue to trespass on private property with that noise machine." I sighed and turned around, plastering on my most diplomatic smile. "Morning, Karen. Beautiful day, isn't it?" She marched across the street, her heels clicking against the asphalt like a countdown timer to my doom. Karen was probably in her late 40s, with bottle blonde hair that looked like it had been welded into place and enough makeup to stock a small cosmetics counter. She wore a pristine white tracksuit that screamed, "I've never done manual labor in my life," and carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no by anyone other than her ex-husband's divorce lawyer. "Don't you beautiful day me, young man," she snapped, jabbing her finger in my direction. "I have had it up to here with your little joy rides through my property." "Karen, I've told you before, I only ride on state land and designated trails. I have every right to be there, and I follow all the regulations." I kept my voice calm, even though my jaw was starting to clench. We'd had this conversation at least a dozen times over the past year. "Oh, please." She rolled her eyes so hard, I was surprised they didn't fall out. "I have it on good authority that you've been cutting through the Riverside development property, tearing up the landscaping and disturbing the wildlife. Mrs. Patterson saw you with her own eyes." Mrs. Patterson was Karen's next-door neighbor and fellow member of what I privately called the Suburban Surveillance Society. She was about as reliable as a chocolate teapot and had once accused a delivery driver of casing her house because he spent 30 seconds checking the address. "I haven't been anywhere near the Riverside development," I said, my patience wearing thinner by the second. "The trails I use are clearly marked and legally accessible." Karen's face turned an interesting shade of red that clashed horribly with her tracksuit. "Well, we'll just see about that, won't we? I'm going to follow you today, and when I catch you trespassing, I'm calling the sheriff, the Forest Service, and the Environmental Protection Agency." I blinked at her, genuinely taken aback. "You're going to follow me? Karen, these trails can be dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. Some of them are pretty technical and—" "I didn't ask for your concern," she interrupted, her voice reaching new heights of indignation. "I'll have you know I drive a brand new Range Rover with all-terrain capabilities. I can go anywhere you can go, probably better." I glanced at her pristine white SUV sitting in her driveway and had to bite back a laugh. That Range Rover had probably never seen anything more challenging than a Whole Foods parking lot. "Karen, seriously, some of these trails are—" "Save it." She held up a hand like a traffic cop. "I'll be right behind you, documenting every single violation, and when I'm done with you, you'll never ride those trails again." She stomped back to her house, leaving me standing there with my mouth hanging open. In all my years of dealing with Karen's complaints, she'd never actually threatened to follow me before. Part of me wanted to call her bluff, but another part, the part that had spent enough time in the woods to know how quickly things could go wrong, was genuinely worried about what might happen if she actually tried to follow me into the backcountry. I finished loading my ATV and decided to stick to the easier trails today. Maybe if Karen saw that I was actually following the rules and staying on designated paths, she'd finally leave me alone. It was a naive hope, but I clung to it anyway. 20 minutes later, I was at the Cascade trailhead, unloading my Grizzly when I heard the distinctive purr of an expensive engine. Karen's white Range Rover pulled into the gravel lot like it was arriving at a country club, completely out of place among the beat-up trucks and utility trailers that normally occupied the space. She climbed out wearing what looked like a safari outfit straight from a catalog, khaki everything, a wide-brimmed hat, and boots that had never seen a speck of mud. She also had a camera hanging around her neck and a smartphone in her hand, presumably ready to document my alleged crimes. "Ready for your little nature documentary?" I asked, unable to keep the sarcasm out of my voice. "Just get going," she snapped, adjusting her hat like she was preparing for an expedition into the Amazon. "I'll be right behind you, gathering evidence." I shook my head and fired up the Grizzly. The familiar rumble of the engine was comforting, and I felt some of my tension ease as I headed toward the trail. Karen followed in her Range Rover, staying much closer than I was comfortable with. The first part of the trail was relatively easy, a wide, well-maintained path that wound through a mixed forest of pine and hardwood. It was the kind of trail that even a stock SUV could handle without too much trouble, though I noticed Karen was already having to navigate around some of the larger rocks and roots that my ATV could easily clear. After about 2 miles, we came to a fork in the trail. The left path continued on the easy route, following an old logging road that eventually led to a scenic overlook. The right path was where things got interesting. It climbed steeply up the side of Copper Ridge, with tight switchbacks, loose rock, and a few technical sections that required real skill to navigate. I stopped at the fork and looked back at Karen, who had gotten out of her Range Rover and was taking pictures of everything in sight. She saw me watching and made an exaggerated show of photographing the trail markers. "See?" she called out, waving her camera. "I'm documenting the exact location where you're about to break the law." I wanted to point out that she was photographing legal trail markers on public land, but I decided to save my breath. Instead, I took the left fork, choosing the easier route in the hope that Karen would be able to follow without getting into trouble. The trail climbed gradually through a beautiful section of forest, with towering pines creating a cathedral-like canopy overhead. Under normal circumstances, this was one of my favorite rides: peaceful, scenic, and just challenging enough to be interesting. But today, every few minutes I had to stop and wait for Karen to catch up, her Range Rover struggling with obstacles that wouldn't even slow down a decent mountain bike. About 4 miles in, we reached a section where the trail crossed a small creek. It wasn't particularly deep or dangerous, but there were some good-sized rocks in the water that could be tricky for a vehicle with low ground clearance. I splashed through without any trouble and stopped on the other side to wait for Karen. She approached the crossing much more cautiously, her Range Rover creeping forward at a snail's pace. I watched as she tried to line up her wheels with the best path through the rocks, but she was taking so long that I started to wonder if she was having second thoughts about this whole expedition. Finally, she committed to the crossing. For a moment, it looked like she might make it across without incident, but then her rear wheel caught on a submerged rock and the Range Rover lurched sideways with a grinding sound that made me wince. Karen gunned the engine, trying to power through, but that only made things worse. The wheel spun uselessly against the rock, and I could see her face turning red with frustration through the windshield. After a few more attempts, she finally managed to get unstuck and made it to the other side, but not without some new scratches along the passenger side of her pristine SUV. She climbed out to inspect the damage, and I could hear her muttering, words that would have made a sailor blush. "Everything okay?" I called out, trying to keep the amusement out of my voice. "Fine," she snapped, though she was clearly anything but fine. "Just keep going. I'm still documenting everything." We continued up the trail, but I could tell Karen was getting rattled. Her following distance had increased, and she was taking longer and longer to navigate obstacles that should have been routine for her supposedly all-terrain vehicle. The trail continued to climb, and after another mile or so, we came to a section that I privately called the Gauntlet. It was a narrow passage between 2 large boulders with just enough space for an ATV to squeeze through. A full-sized SUV would have to take a much longer detour around a series of switchbacks to avoid the obstacle. I stopped before the narrow passage and waited for Karen to catch up. When she finally arrived, she got out of her Range Rover and walked up to inspect. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that Karen Whitmore had been planning this confrontation for months. And what she didn't know was that her elaborate scheme was about to backfire in the most spectacular way imaginable. As I headed toward Devil's Backbone, my ATV's engine purring with anticipation, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror that made my blood run cold. Karen wasn't just following me anymore. She was talking on her phone, and there was something about her body language that suggested this wasn't a casual conversation. The trail to Devil's Backbone was aptly named. It was a narrow ridge that dropped off sharply on both sides, with loose shale that could send an inexperienced rider tumbling into the canyon below. The path was barely wide enough for an ATV, let alone a full-sized SUV, but I figured Karen would have to turn back long before we reached the really dangerous sections. I was wrong. About halfway up the approach to the ridge, I heard the distinctive whine of not one, but 3 different engines behind me. I stopped and looked back, my heart sinking as I saw the cavalry Karen had called in. Behind her struggling Range Rover were 2 other vehicles, a sheriff's patrol SUV and what looked like a Forest Service truck. Son of a... I muttered, suddenly understanding the full scope of Karen's plan. She hadn't just decided to follow me on a whim. She'd orchestrated this entire thing, probably calling her contacts in law enforcement before she'd even left her driveway. This wasn't about catching me trespassing. This was about creating a situation where I'd look guilty regardless of what I actually did. My mind raced as I tried to figure out my options. I could turn around and go back, but that would mean confronting 3 vehicles on a narrow trail with limited room to maneuver. I could continue forward and hope to reach a wider section where we could sort this out, but that meant leading them all into increasingly dangerous terrain. Then I remembered something that made my stomach drop even further. My ATV was equipped with a GPS tracking system, a high-end unit that recorded every mile I rode, every trail I took, and every stop I made. It was connected to an app on my phone that I used to track my rides and share routes with friends. More importantly, it kept detailed logs that could prove exactly where I'd been and when. But Karen didn't know about the GPS. And if she was really trying to frame me for trespassing, those logs might be the only thing that could save me. I fired up the Grizzly and continued toward Devil's Backbone, but now I was riding with a different purpose. Instead of trying to lose my unwanted entourage, I needed to get to a safe location where we could stop and sort this mess out before someone got hurt. The trail continued to climb, and I could hear the engines behind me struggling with the increasingly difficult terrain. The sheriff's SUV seemed to be handling the conditions reasonably well, but the Forest Service truck was clearly having trouble, and Karen's Range Rover sounded like it was on its last legs. As we approached the base of Devil's Backbone, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. There was another vehicle parked in the small clearing where the ridge trail began, a beat-up pickup truck that I recognized immediately. It belonged to Jake Morrison, my cousin, and one of the few people who knew these trails better than I did. Jake was standing next to his truck, and he wasn't alone. With him were 2 other men I didn't recognize, both wearing official-looking jackets. As I got closer, I could see that one of them had a camera, and the other was holding what looked like surveying equipment. I pulled into the clearing and shut off my engine, my mind spinning with confusion. Jake walked over with a grin on his face, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he knew more about what was happening than he was letting on. "Hey, cousin," he said, his voice carrying a note of barely contained excitement. "Perfect. Timing, we were just finishing up here." "Jake, what's going on?" I asked, but before he could answer, Karen's convoy arrived in the clearing like a small army. The sheriff, a tall, weathered man named Pete Hawkins, who I'd known since high school, climbed out of his SUV with a resigned expression. Behind him came a Forest Service ranger I didn't recognize, and finally Karen herself, looking like she'd just survived a natural disaster. "Tyler Morrison," Sheriff Hawkins said, his voice carrying the weight of official authority. "We need to have a conversation." Karen immediately jumped in, her voice shrill with righteous indignation. "There! You see? I told you he was trespassing. He led us on a wild goose chase through restricted areas, and now he's trying to cover his tracks." "Ma'am, please," the sheriff said, holding up a hand. "Let me handle this." But Karen was just getting started. She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through photos. I have documented evidence of him riding through the Riverside development property, damaging private landscaping, and disturbing protected wildlife habitats. Mrs. Patterson saw him, herself, and we have witnesses who can testify. Actually, Jake interrupted, and there was something in his tone that made everyone stop and look at him. I think there's been a misunderstanding. He gestured to the two men with him. This is Mark Chen from the County Assessor's Office, and this is David Rodriguez from the State Land Management Bureau. We've been out here all morning conducting a property survey. Karen's face went pale. A property survey? What kind of property? Survey? Mark Chen stepped forward, consulting a tablet in his hands. Mrs. Whitmore, I believe you filed a complaint about ATV trespassing on the Riverside development property? Yes, I did. Karen's voice was becoming more shrill by the second. This man has been repeatedly... Ma'am, David Rodriguez interrupted. I'm afraid there's been a significant error in your complaint. He pulled out a large map and spread it across the hood of Jake's truck. These are the most recent property boundaries based on our GPS survey. The Riverside development property line is actually located here. He pointed to a line on the map that was at least a quarter-mile away from where we were standing. Karen looked at the map, her face growing paler by the second. That can't be right. The property markers clearly show... The property markers you've been referring to are actually old survey stakes from a logging operation that was conducted here 15 years ago, Mark Chen explained. They have no legal bearing on current property boundaries. Sheriff Hawkins was studying the map with interest. So you're telling me that all of the areas where Mrs. Whitmore claims trespassing occurred are actually on state land? That's correct, Rodriguez confirmed. Every single trail that Mr. Morrison has been using is on designated state forest land, open to legal recreational use. The silence that followed was deafening. Karen stood there, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, while the full scope of her mistake became clear to everyone present. But Jake wasn't done. He walked over to my ATV and pointed to the GPS unit mounted on the handlebars. Tyler, why don't you show them your tracking data? I pulled out my phone and opened the app, my hands shaking slightly as I realized what Jake was getting at. The GPS logs showed every ride I'd taken over the past year, with precise coordinates and timestamps. Here, I said, holding out my phone, to Sheriff Hawkins. This shows every trail I've ridden in the past 12 months. You can cross-reference the coordinates with the property boundaries. The sheriff studied the data for several minutes, occasionally glancing at the survey map. Finally, he looked up with an expression of barely contained amusement. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, according to this data, Mr. Morrison has never been within 200 yards of the actual Riverside development property line. Every single ride he's taken has been on legal designated trail systems. Karen's world was crumbling around her, but she wasn't ready to give up. But Mrs. Patterson saw him. She saw him with her own eyes. Mrs. Patterson, Jake said with a grin, was probably seeing Tyler riding on the Pine Ridge Trail, which runs parallel to the development, but is separated from it by a quarter-mile of state forest. From her backyard, it would be easy to mistake the sound of an ATV on the legal trail for trespassing on private property. The Forest Service ranger had been quiet up until now, but he finally spoke up. Mrs. Whitmore, I have to ask, did you file a formal complaint with our office about illegal ATV use? Karen nodded vigorously. Yes, I did. I filed multiple complaints. And did you provide specific locations and evidence for these complaints? Of course I did. I gave you exact coordinates and photographic evidence. The ranger consulted his own tablet. Ma'am, I'm looking at your complaint files and I'm afraid there's a problem. The coordinates you provided for alleged trespassing incidents are not only on state land, but they're also within designated recreational areas. Filing false reports about illegal activity on public land is a serious matter. Karen's face went from pale to bright red in the span of about 3 seconds. False reports? I didn't file any false reports. I was acting in good faith based on the information I had. Information that was incorrect, Sheriff Hawkins pointed out. Mrs. Whitmore, you've wasted considerable law enforcement resources based on a misunderstanding of property boundaries. But more importantly, you've been harassing Mr. Morrison for months over activities that were completely legal. I should have felt vindicated, but mostly I just felt sorry for Karen. She stood there, in her ruin,